Thank you very much for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about Sage 100's Custom Office module. Let's take a look at what Custom Office can do. So Custom Office is actually a very versatile module and can do a number of things. And we're going to talk about these things over several sessions. So what are the things that Custom Office can do? And in practice, the most common use of Custom Office is to create user-defined fields. Now, when we create user-defined fields, we can add user-defined fields to master tables like customer master, vendor master, inventory master, general ledger master, any of those kinds of things. Now, the nice thing about adding user-defined fields to these tables is it's a way to just give yourself the opportunity to store additional data about that particular item, whether it's a customer, a vendor, inventory item, or what have you. But also, when you add these user-defined fields, they are available to the standard lookups in Sage 100. So they can be used to select various entities based on the lookup, those kinds of things. They also can be used to print on reports and those kinds of things as well. And we'll talk about that. But the other thing you can do with user-defined fields is you can add them to transaction tables. So for example, you might be entering an accounts payable invoice, and there's an additional piece of information at the line level of that invoice that you wish to capture. And you want to record that into the transaction table and then modify a report to pull that data back at a later date. We could do that as well. We can also add user-defined fields to work tables, the tables that are used to feed standard Sage 100 reports. And the values that come from those user-defined fields can be entered into the user-defined field directly in one of the transaction entry screens. Or sometimes what we do is actually pull the value from a standard field and populate the user-defined field. And we do that only because that field data is not available to the work table directly. And in Chris reports, we often have an option of linking to another table to pull the data. But frankly, sometimes it just makes more sense to create that user-defined field and let Sage 100 pull that data instead of having Crystal pull that data, because then it's a lot faster. Another use of user-defined field and custom office is to change the look of the screens. So when we add a user-defined field, we can put the user-defined field on the screen. But in addition to that, we can also change the look of screens. We can move fields around. We can add color to a field. We can make various changes. And what's really nice about this is that these changes on the screens can be either user specific or they can be group specific. And so sometimes what we've done is actually removed data from a screen based on who the user is or who the group is. For example, I've had clients want me to remove inventory item cost information from the item maintenance and inquiry screens for salespeople. So they still want to give their salespeople access to the screen so they can see the attributes of the particular item, but they don't want the salespeople to know the cost of the item. Another function of Custom Office is that you can add user-defined tables, and user-defined tables can be used to validate values in the user-defined fields, which is really cool. Then you can also provide lookups to those user-defined fields from the values in the user-defined table to allow the user to select a valid value. You can also tie a user-defined table to a standard Sage 100 field. It doesn't have to be a user-defined field. And once again, it can be used to provide a lookup to the user and to validate the value to the field. Another use of Custom Office is you can, in some circumstances, use it to define default values to fields. So if there's a particular field on a particular screen and you want it to have a default because the user doesn't normally select that field, you can set it up so it defaults a value in. You can also make any of the fields required. And if you make a field required, then the user must populate a value in that field before being able to save that entity. For example, think about the customer maintenance screen. You might have a field, standard field is customer type, and you want to make sure that it gets populated every time a new customer is set up. So it could be used for that as well. Let's take a look at today's agenda. So today we're just going to focus on the use of a user-defined field and a pretty simple example. So we're going to add a user-defined field to the inventory item master table. So we're going to create the user-defined field, and then we're going to add a tab. We're going to modify the item maintenance screen to add a tab to hold that user-defined field. And then we'll add the user-defined field to the tab, and we'll populate some values, and then I'll show you where the data is stored and how we can get at it. So let's go ahead and get started. So here I am in Sage 100, and I'm just going to open up the Custom Office module, and I'm going to go into User-Defined Field and Table Maintenance. And what this is going to do is give me a list by module of all the tables that I can add user-defined fields for. You can also see that there could be things listed that have recently been modified just for convenience. So we're going to add a user-defined field to the item master file or the item maintenance screen. And I know, you may not know, but I know that that's actually in a table called Common Information, Item Master. So we're going to go to the Common Information or CI Item Master table. And I'm just going to double click and choose Edit Fields. Now this is just going to open up a window that'll show me all the existing user-defined fields for this table, and there are none. So we're going to hit the plus sign to create a new one. And now we're going to give it a name. So I recently had an example where the customer wanted to store the item's UPC code for each item because they needed to report that to a particular vendor based on sales history, things like that. Not to get too complicated, we're just going to add a field to the item master file, and we might as well call it UPC code. So I'll just type that in as the field name, and notice that it will automatically add UDF as the first part of the name and add underscores where I had typed in spaces. And then it also puts in the item description. Now, when we add the field to the screen, it's going to use this item description by default. So I'm going to go ahead and just edit that slightly and make UPC all in uppercase. Our next element here is the source for the UDF data. And there's two sources. We can pull data from another table into this particular field if we want to. So if there's another table that makes sense, we could say it's a business object and we can pull data from one of these other tables. In our example today, we're not going to do that. It's just going to be manual entry. So when we're in item maintenance, we're just going to manually enter that value. So let's go ahead and say OK. And that pops up the screen to enter the type. So as you can see here, there are multiple types of user-defined fields. So the most common one used here is multi-line, which simply means it's just a field that you enter the value in. But you can also have one for drop box. And a drop box is the kind of field that has a little down arrow and it opens up a series of values that the user can select from. And those values, if I chose Dropbox, would be indicated over here on the validation tab. So I can create a field that has valid values already defined for the field, and the user can select those. Now, earlier I mentioned that you could do this with a user-defined table. Well, this is a different way of doing it. And this way, frankly, can be used quite effectively if there are two conditions that are true. One is that there aren't a lot of values. You really don't want a drop box if there's whatever we think a lot means, but let's just say, for sake of argument, more than 10 values, because it gets kind of tedious to have to scroll through all the values. The other reason you would not want to do this is if the values changed frequently. The advantage of the user-defined table is you can go edit that table anytime you want and add or delete existing values that you're using for validation. Here, you have to come into Custom Office and do that. And what we haven't talked about yet is when you update these changes to that table, these changes can only be updated to that table when that table is not in use. So typically this kind of work is done in off hours when other users are not in the system. Doesn't have to be that way. It depends on what the table is. But if you're constantly coming in here and changing your validation list, and you have to kick everybody out to do it, or you have to do it in off hours, it's just not very practical to do it with a drop down. It also could be a list box or a checkbox. Now, obviously, a checkbox is just yes or no. So you can have a checkbox, you check it on for yes, and you check it off for no. So I'm going to leave it as a multi-line. And then we can have the data type being string or text. We mean text by string. And if it's a string field, we can define the length. And so, for example, I can say it's going to be equal to 15 characters, but it also can be numeric. It'll create a numeric type user-defined field and will act like a number. So if you type in a value, it'll automatically add the trailing zeros and those kinds of things. Or the field can be a date field. And if it's a date field, you get the standard Sage 100 calendar function for selecting the date or just typing it in. And then there's other display attributes as well. I can always say it has to be uppercase and things like that. You can also put in mass, a default value for it, those kinds of things as well. Now notice for the caption, it pulled in my description from above. So let's just go ahead and say okay. And then we'll go ahead and say update here. And we'll say, yes, we want to update that. Now, if you have a lot of companies within your Sage 100, understand that anytime you create a user-defined field for a particular table, it does it across all of your companies. This is not company specific. Now, when you add the user-defined field to the screen, you can choose which company you're adding it to the screen for. But in terms of the data and where it's stored, it's modified that table across all of the companies. And we're done with that, so we'll just go ahead and close that. Back to our agenda. So now that we've created the user-defined field, our UPC code, we're now going to go to item maintenance. We're going to add the tab and then add the user-defined field to the tab and go on to our next step. So now back in Sage 100, we're going to go ahead and modify the screen to do the data entry. Now there's a couple of different ways that I can get to where I need to go, and a lot of people don't know this, but you can actually be in the screen you want to modify, and you can do Control F9. It will open up the customizer, which is the tool for modifying the screens within Custom Office, or you can go back to Custom Office and open up customizers directly, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to open up Customizer, go to Inventory Management, and I'm going to go to Item Maintenance, and I'm going to choose the Item Maintenance screen, this one called D Main, and just double click on that and edit the panel. Now, anytime we edit a panel, we can choose to do it for all users, all companies, or just the company that we're in, however we want to do that. So I'll say all users, but just the company we're in. Now, you can also do this for customization groups as well. So you can do individual users or customization groups, but we'll just say all users, the company that we're in, and we'll say okay. And that's going to pop up our customization screen. Now, these are the standard tabs that are in item maintenance. And all I'm going to do is go into the big main area here and double click. And that's going to open up the screen that shows me all of the tabs. Well, I'm just going to add a tab. So I'm going to hit the add button here, and that's going to create a tab. And notice it's automatically going to assign it the 8th position. And now I'm just going to give it a name. And I'm going to call it UDFs. Now, one thing to understand about this, yes, we can add user-defined fields to any of the tabs. We do not have to create a separate tab for the user-defined field. However, the standard tabs are pretty busy. They have a lot of data on them already, and it's sometimes difficult to find space to put the user-defined field. The other thing is that sometimes we'll add it to this version of Sage 100 where there's space, and then Sage will make a change to the screen in a future release where they will add data to that same space. And now all of a sudden we have a conflict between what Sage has added and what I'm using in that space. So over the years, I've just gotten in the habit of adding my own tab that I maintain. However, the problem with that, of course, is then the user has to go to that tab, or I have to define the field as a required field so that the user has to enter a value. So sometimes it still makes sense to put the user defined field on an existing tab because of the flow of the data entry in that particular screen. In this case, I'm just going to add the user defined fields tab and click OK. And as you can see, it added it. So now when I double click on it, it'll list it, and I can highlight it and say, go to that panel. And when I go to that panel, it looks like this. It's just blank. So what we're going to do is look at our toolbar on the left, and there's a number of different things we can do here. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can hover over them and you can see there's tool tips that'll tell you what it's going to do. But the one I want is to add a field. So I'm going to click that, and then I'm just going to draw a box where I want the field to go. And it's going to pop up a window asking me what field do you wish to add. And look at all the tables that I can pull the data from. Now, there are some restrictions here. First of all, it has to make sense. So since we're in the item maintenance screen, it has to be a field related to the item. So it has to make some sense. The other thing is you can't add a field that's already on the screen somewhere else. So I can't move the fields. I cannot also delete standard Sage 100 fields from the screens. I can change them so their sizes are very small, but I can't remove them. So under CI underscore item code, you can see under main, we have our user defined field. So I'm going to go ahead and assign that to that field. And notice that it automatically brought in our description, as I mentioned earlier. Now, if I highlight this field and right mouse click, I get a screen that gives me some attributes of the particular field. So I can see what the text value is, what the font is. I can have it be a different font. I can make it bold. I can have it be a different color, all kinds of things here. Under options, I can tell it what column and row the width and height of the field is. So if I want this in column 1 instead of 2, and I want it in row 0.1 instead of 0.5, I can do that. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the user-defined field itself. This time I'm going to go to options, and I'm going to say, okay, I want it in column 10, that's fine. But since my text is in row 1, I want that in row 1. Now, when I define my user-defined field, I define it as a 15-character field, so maybe I want the width to be around 15 characters. Now, you usually want it displayed a couple of characters wider because of the buttons that may be there or something like that. The other thing is I want this to have a height of 1. So I just want it to be a standard height, and I want it to be a tab stop. And again, I can do some other things here as well. I can also add some data validation here also. Let's go ahead and do that. Now, before I save this, let's see what it looks like. So there is a preview button here, and you can see that it's going to look like that. Well, that looks pretty good to me. So we'll go ahead and close the preview, and we'll close that, and it's going to ask me if I want to save my changes, and we'll go ahead and say yes, and we're done. So we'll go ahead and close Custom Office. So now here we are back at our agenda. Our next thing to do is to go to item maintenance, make sure that the tab is there, make sure that the field is there, and that we can add data to the field, and then verify that the data is in fact being stored. So back in Sage 100, let's go to item maintenance, and we'll just call up our first item. So as you can see, there is in fact a UDF's tab. So go ahead and select that tab, and there is a field for UPC code, and we can just type the value in. Now, when we created this user-defined field, it automatically modified the CI underscore item table in Sage 100 and added this field. So from this point forward, that field is acting just like any other field that's been in that table. That's why it goes through all of the companies and does that. There's no difference from one company to another. So Visual Integrator can be used to import these values, just like any other field that's in the item master file. Crystal reports can be used to print this value by linking to this table, just like any other field that's in this table. So let's go ahead and just populate a value, and we'll accept that. And we'll go back and look and make sure that it stored it. Well, in addition to Visual Integrator Crystal reports, these values are automatically added to Business Insights Explorer views as well, because Business Insights Explorer just reads the standard tables. So if I open up Business Insights Explorer for the item view and get a list of my items, what I can do is I can add that user-defined fields. Let's just go ahead and take a number of fields off here so that we have room for it without having to scroll. And so I'm just removing these fields just for illustration purposes only. Okay, I'm going to right mouse click on my column heading, go to column settings, and I'm going to add a new column. And I'm going to pull that column from the CI_item table, scroll clear to the bottom. There's my user-defined field. I'll say OK, and OK, and there it is. So as you can see, that value that I typed in item maintenance is in fact stored in this table. So as a recap from our agenda, we added a user-defined field to the item master table called CI_item. We created the user-defined field, and we added a tab to item maintenance, and then we added the user-defined field on the new tab. So basically, anytime that we do a user-defined field, there's essentially two steps in this example. One is to create the field, and the second step is to add it to the screen. So if this was a customer user-defined field, we would have added it to the customer maintenance screen. If it was a vendor user-defined field, we would have added it to the vendor maintenance screen. We added it to a new tab just because for inventory items anyway, the existing tabs are pretty busy. There's not a lot of room to add fields to those screens. We populated the value, and we made sure that it stored it by looking up the item in Business Insights Explorer. Please subscribe to our channel and our user group. You can find us on LinkedIn. Of course, our website is www.nimsassociates.com. You can contact us directly at erp@nimsassociates.com or call the number on your screen. You'll get alerts for later contents and those kinds of things as we do these sessions going forward. And thank you very much for your attention today. We really appreciate it.